Let's take a look in depth at these two categories and how they obtain energy. We are going to start with producers. Producers are mainly of two types. We have plants, which are the main types of producers, but we also have bacteria. They do things differently. There are some bacteria that can make their own food, while there are other bacteria that break down things. So plants and bacteria produce food, but they produce it in two different chemical reactions. Let's start with plants to make it easier. What plants do is they mainly use the process of photosynthesis. But not only plants use photosynthesis. Keep that sentence in mind. So, plants simply make food using the process of photosynthesis, right? We all know that. But how? So, plants produce their food by absorbing sunlight and carbon dioxide and water to give off glucose and oxygen. This is the chemical formula for photosynthesis, right? So they take in sunlight that they absorb and they react it with carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose. What is glucose? Glucose is a very important thing because glucose is a sugar that all organisms on Earth need to produce energy. And they produce oxygen as a waste product. So photosynthesis is technically from light. Something very important we need to keep in mind is that also some kinds of bacteria make photosynthesis. Like cyanobacteria, which is a type of bacteria that uses photosynthesis to make food. The other process, so the first process that organisms produce food is called photosynthesis. This is number one. The second process that organisms use to produce food is called chemosynthesis. Chemosynthesis is a process mainly used by bacteria. So, some bacteria live in very dark places, so they cannot get the light that they need. So they rely on chemicals in the environment, which is why it's called chemosynthesis. Chemo comes from chemical and photo comes from light. That's how you can link it, okay? So what is chemosynthesis? Chemosynthesis is a process that some producers use to do what? To change chemical energy into food energy. So, what's different here, keep in mind again, chemo and photo, they use chemical energy, not light energy. So bacteria make their food from chemicals. Because a lot of bacteria live deep in the ocean, near the ocean floors, or near volcano vents, which is why they use chemosynthesis to obtain food. Before moving on to consumers, let's ask ourselves a question. Why must producers be present in an environment? It's a very important question we should ask ourselves. Why do we need producers? We can simply have consumers and that's it. Well, what makes the world actually exist are producers. How? Because producers are the ones that make energy, make food from energy. Producers make energy into forms that are available. Available to what? Into forms that are available, that other organisms can use. So this is why we need producers, because they take sunlight energy or chemical energy to actually change this kind of energy into food. But for example, a lion or a tiger or even a human being, how would they convert sunlight energy into food? This is what producers are mostly needed for. So, producers are done. We are going to go into the other type that we discussed. What is this other type? Consumers. Keep the word consumers in mind because there are many kinds of consumers. It's not just two like producers. Consumers are organisms. Let's start with the definition to make it simpler. Consumers are organisms that cannot make their own food. So, because consumers cannot make their own food, they eat other organisms to get energy. So, they rely on eating other organisms to get energy. This is simply from the name, consume and produce. Consume, take, use. Produce, they actually make it. So, when it comes to consumers, we have a couple of kinds, a few actually. We have carnivores, omnivores, herbivores, and finally, detritivores, which also detritivores have two kinds, scavengers and decomposers. Alhamdulillah. Okay, sorry. So, we're gonna go into each of these. Simply, let's start with the simplest from the beginning. Carnivores. What happens to carnivores? They eat other consumers. They do not just eat meat. Well, actually, consumers, insects are considered a sort of meat, right? They also eat insects, like an anteater, for example. An anteater is an example of an organism that eats ants, insects. Also, there are lions and cheetahs, other types of consumers. So they eat other consumers. So this is carnivores. The second kind is herbivores. From its name, herbivores. Herbivores, herbs, plants. So herbivores are animals that obtain energy by eating other plants. Eat other plants. So animals that eat plants are technically herbivores. They eat technically, okay, let's make it a bit more clear. Let's say herbivores eat consumers. Sorry, eat producers like plants. Plants mainly, actually. And then the third kind we're going to discuss are omnivores, which are like us humans. Herbivores can be cows or sheep. Omnivores are technically organisms that eat both, producers and consumers. So, for example, bears. They eat berries and plants as well as fish. And of course, as humans, we're omnivores. We eat both animals and plants. Hello, class. This week, we're going to finally be finishing Chapter 9, Interactions of Living Things. We're going to be taking Lesson 3, the last lesson, Energy and Matter. You're going to find it in our textbook, pages 324 to 330. When it comes to the keywords that you're going to hear a lot and we're going to discuss in our lesson for the week, we have producers, consumers, food chain and food web, energy pyramid, and the water cycle. When it comes to the objectives that we're going to be fulfilling this week, we're going to identify producers and consumers, consumers of all their kinds and producers of all their kinds as well. We're going to compare food chains and food webs. We're going to design an energy pyramid and recognize the water cycle. All living things, which are biotic factors, require one very important thing, which is energy. Some of the biotic factors take their energy from the sun. So this is our first source of energy. Sorry. While others eat abiotic factors. No, let's go first for the ones that cannot convert their energy from the sun. They take it from chemical energy. They convert chemical energy into food. Sunlight, energy. And the organisms that cannot convert sunlight energy or chemical energy, what they do is they eat other biotic factors. So, as a result, we can see that energy flows in an ecosystem. This flow can be represented by either a food chain or a food web. Let's think of it like this. We said energy flows, but how does energy flow? A very important question. How does energy flow? When an organism eats another organism, so first of all, organism eats other. What happens to this energy? It's cut into two parts, not two halves actually. Energy is cut into a part where the organism that eats it, that is eaten, its energy is transferred. So, transferred from prey to predator. Or let's not say prey to predator because that's not how all the relationships are. Transferred from eaten creature to eating creature, to eating organism. So it goes from the creature that is being eaten to the organism that eats it. This is part of the energy. The other part of the energy that is transferred, and it flows, doesn't really transfer, is the energy that is used for daily life. Daily life activities like what? Breathing, eating, moving. All these are activities that require energy. So when it comes to energy, energy flows. So this is a very important point we need to look at. It flows like this. It never goes back to its resource, to its original source, but matter cycles. And we're going to look into it, how matter cycles. It goes in a loop, goes back to its original place at times. Matter like what? Elements, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and most importantly, the one we're actually discussing is water. All these are matter that cycle in an ecosystem. Okay, we said that some organisms can convert light energy into food, other organisms can convert chemical energy into food, other organisms cannot even make food. They just eat other organisms. So how do we classify organisms? This is also a very important question. Organisms are classified based on the way they get the energy they need to survive, which is technically how they get food. So we can simply say classified based on their diet, what they eat, So animals are classified based on their diet. Almost all energy that's on Earth comes from one place, the sun. Source of all energy on Earth. Okay, so some organisms can make their food using sunlight, while others capture energy from chemicals in the environment to make their food. And there are other organisms that cannot capture energy from chemicals nor sunlight. So what they do is they rely on organisms that they can. So they obtain energy by eating it. So we agreed that living organisms obtain energy by making food. So obtain energy. How? By making food. Or let's say no, not all organisms make food. By getting food, let's say. Or making food. Let's make it a bit broad. Okay, so there are two types of organisms based on how they obtain their food. The two types of organisms are, first of all, producers. Producers are very simple. And the other kind are consumers. Let's take a look at each of them in detail so we can actually understand what's going on. Let's give a brief introduction first. What are producers? Producers are simply organisms that make their own food. It's very simple because producers produce. So they change the energy available in the environment into food energy. Change energy available in environment to make food. This ability is only for producers. How about the other kind of organism? We said we're going to classify them, right? We classified them into producers and consumers. Let's take a look at the other kind, consumers. Consumers are the second kind of organisms. Consumers cannot make their food. So what they do is they rely on organisms that can. If I cannot make my own food, I still need to survive. So how do I get this energy? Eating other organisms. Or let's say eating organisms that can make their own food. Okay, because they're separate. Consumers are into different kinds. So not all consumers eat organisms that can make their own food. So they technically eat other organisms. So we already finished our first 3 kinds of organisms or categories of organisms. Now we're going to get to detrivores. What are detritivores? They are organisms that eat dead plants and animals. There are 2 kinds, decomposers and scavengers. Let's start with decomposers. Decomposers break down dead material into simple molecules that can be used by other organisms. Other organisms like what? Fungi and bacteria. Decomposers are generally very small organisms. They can be so tiny that they're microorganisms as well. So decomposers break down the dead material into simple molecules that can be used, and they're microorganisms. The other kind of detritivores are scavengers. Scavengers are big organisms that feed on dead organisms, like hyenas and raccoons. So one are big, others are small. Some break down the dead materials in simple molecules, and others feed on the dead organisms. Let's actually compare scavengers and decomposers. Scavengers are large animals. This is a very important point. Decomposers are small organisms or microorganisms. When it comes to the process of decomposing, Scavengers start it and decomposers finish it. Now we're done our first objective, identifying producers and consumers. Okay, now let's start with our second objective, comparing a food chain and a food web. No matter where on earth you go, living things are connected. From the tiniest of organisms to the largest of creatures. All organisms need one very important thing: energy. It's needed by literally all organisms. We need it to survive. So where does all that energy come from? Well, matter and energy pass from an organism to another. How do they pass from the energy pass organism to another? How does it pass from an organism to another? It's simply energy passes from one organism to another, connecting living things in a chain, a food chain. It's not an actual chain, but it's a way to talk about the relationship between organisms and to show how energy flows in a food chain. All living organisms are a part of a food chain, including us humans. And most things are part of more than one single food chain. A food chain, let's start with describing what a food chain is to be able to continue. A food chain models how energy flows in an ecosystem through a feeding relationship. So they eat each other, eat each other, eat each other. Let's try designing a food chain. Every food chain should begin with a producer. What do you think we should add here? We can add any kind of flower, any kind of tree, plant, grass. Let's go with sunflower. Sunflower is our producer because we said all food chains should start with a producer. That's because animals cannot create their own food. They must eat food or consume energy from other sources. So this is our first chain. Our second chain is a consumer. What do you think the consumers that eat plants are called? An herbivore. The second chain in our food chain is an herbivore. An herbivore like what? We can say a rabbit, a mouse, a grasshopper. Let's think of it. When an animal eats a plant, some of the energy that the plant captured from the sun is transferred to the animal's body, where it's used for things like movement, eating, and growing. An herbivore is called a primary consumer as well, because it is the first consumer. So, our first consumer is an herbivore, because an animal, we need, primary means first, so we need an animal that eats plants as a first consumer in our food chain. So let's add a grasshopper, and my drawing is very bad. I'm sorry, I don't even know what this is. Let's say grasshopper. So this grasshopper is our primary consumer. Next comes a secondary consumer. 3. Secondary consumer. A secondary consumer can be a consumer that eats both, because it's the second consumer in a food chain. This consumer can be a carnivore, an omnivore. Let's say a carnivore, because it gets energy from eating other animals. So here we have a carnivore. What do you think is a carnivore that eats grasshopper? Maybe our grasshopper will be eaten by a mouse. Okay, that is one weird mouse. Our grasshopper will be eaten by a mouse. When the mouse eats the grasshopper, part of the energy that the grasshopper gets from the sunflower is transferred to the mouse. And the mouse, which is an omnivore, can get energy because we know it's an herbivore. And a mouse, which is an omnivore, can get energy by eating both animals and plants. So it doesn't really matter what it's going to eat. So this is our first food chain. Do you think that's it, or should we continue? Okay, well, let's add a tertiary consumer. 4, which is our third consumer, which is a carnivore that gets its energy by eating other animals. So what kind of animal can eat a mouse? Let's say a snake, for example. So a snake. Actually, let's keep a mouse as an omnivore because it eats both. It can eat insects and it can eat plants. So a mouse is an omnivore. Sorry for this mistake. So when the snake eats the mouse, part of the energy that the mouse got from the grasshopper that ate the sunflower is transferred into the snake. So this snake gets energy from all these. But think about it. This helps us learn what? Well, let's look at the stages of a food chain. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4. We had first sunflower, followed by a grasshopper that was eaten by a mouse, who was eaten by a snake. So this food chain is made of 4 levels. What can we learn about it? Well, each stage of a food chain has less available food energy than the one before. Each stage of a food chain has less energy than the one before it. But keep in mind, less food energy, less available food energy. So the energy, how about the rest of the energy? Well, simply because a lot of this energy is converted to heat energy. So the energy absorbed by the sunflower was first transferred to the grasshopper, which transferred it to the mouse, and then the mouse transferred it to the snake. And through each level, thermal energy is released into the environment. Let's think about it like this. Only 10% is transferred between each level and the other. Why do you think? It's because a lot of energy is used for daily life activities. So think of it like this. Minimal energy, when it's moved to the next level, it decreases. Food chains are simple models, but they do not show all the levels of energy in an ecosystem, which is why we need food webs. What do you think a food web is? A food web is technically a model that shows what? Several connected food chains. So we agreed that the food chain, it transfers or actually shows how energy flows in an ecosystem through a feeding relationship. And then how about a food web? Well, a food web is a model that shows several connected food chains. A food web gives more information than a food chain. Why? Because as they show many ways energy flows in an ecosystem, it also shows how energy travels. Energy travels through what? Energy travels through terrestrial and aquatic biomes. So it's not just energy transferred in one area or one kind of place. For example, a raccoon. A raccoon is in a terrestrial biome, right? But raccoons might eat crayfish in a stream. So crayfish in a stream are aquatic biomes and raccoons are terrestrial biomes where there's a relationship between them. The raccoon can eat the crayfish. But food webs also show different pathways for energy. For example, remember the mouse in our food chain? It shouldn't have been eaten only by a snake. It could have been eaten by a fox or a hawk. So there are different paths. This crayfish could have been eaten by a bear. It didn't have to be a raccoon. which is why food webs give us more information than food chains.
Take a look at another example of a food chain, which of course starts with a producer, which is our flower, that is being eaten by our caterpillar, our primary consumer, our first consumer, which is an herbivore that eats plants. And then this caterpillar is eaten by a secondary consumer, our frog, which is an omnivore that eats both insects and plants, followed by a snake, which is another consumer that eats animals, which is technically called a carnivore, and followed by our last consumer, which is an owl, which eats the snake. And this cycle could go on and on and on. For example, the owl doesn't have to eat a snake. It can eat a mouse, which is why if we have a missing level or a missing organism, this will not really affect the whole cycle much, the whole chain, because owls don't only eat snakes. They eat mice, they eat rats, they eat hamsters. So if snakes don't exist, it's still okay. And the same example is for all the other organisms in our food chain.
Okay, now let's talk about our third objective, modeling an energy pyramid. An energy pyramid is technically a part of a food chain. It shows the amount of energy available at each step of a food chain. We already agreed that as energy travels through different organisms, the amount of available food energy decreases. And we use the food energy pyramid to show this process. We all agreed as well that a food chain starts with a producer. A plant, for example, grass, which is eaten by a primary consumer, a grasshopper, which is also eaten by a secondary consumer, a frog. And our secondary consumer is also being eaten by a tertiary consumer, which is our snake. And the food chain could keep going. Notice how the arrows point towards the thing that eats, which makes sense because that's the direction of the energy flow. We can also arrange the same food chain in an energy pyramid. The producers are at the base and are in the first trophic level. So we have the producers at the base. They actually contain the most energy. What is crazy to think about it is that the primary consumers have in trophic level 2, they actually only store 10%. So the consumers, the primary consumers in trophic level 2, they can actually only store 10% of the energy from the producers. So let's take an example. And it's also 10% here, all from the level before it, okay? So let's say the trophic level 1 has 10,000 kcals. Kcals are a unit for energy. And only 10% of this 10,000 kcal go to trophic level 2 for the primary consumers. So here we have only 1,000 kcal. And the same thing goes up as you go on. Only 10% moves to the next level.
Shows us an example of an energy pyramid, where at the bottom, at the first level, at the first trophic level, we have producers, which are technically grass or flowers. 10% of this energy is transferred to the primary consumers, which are the rabbits that eat these grass or plants. Energy is lost, and some of it is transferred to the secondary consumers, the snakes, which also are being eaten by tertiary consumers, or our top carnivores, which is the eagle, which receives the least energy because energy is constantly being lost on each level and only 10% is transferred to the next trophic level. I hope energy pyramids and linking them to the food chain was clear because they're technically the same thing but just in more order. Now we're going to go to matter cycles. Let's first agree on what matter is before actually going into cycles. Matter is a physical material that makes up the world around us, everything on Earth, including ourselves. We discussed earlier how energy flows in an ecosystem, but matter cycles, it doesn't flow, which means it goes back to its original source or form. It's used again and again by different parts of an ecosystem. Matter changes form, but it does not change. We'll be discussing we will be discussing the water cycle, a very important cycle, but it's not the only cycle that's there. There's nitrogen cycle, oxygen cycle, carbon cycle, and a lot more. So, let's start. So this is the last part of our lesson, identifying the water cycle. Water is the most important element for life. All the water that is on Earth now, every single drop, is all the water that has ever been on the planet. Water is constantly moving, it never stops. Though some water seems still, all water moves. Water moves in a cycle called the water cycle. Let's take a look at how this water moves. Observe the water cycle in front of us. When the sun warms the water on Earth's surface, it evaporates, converting itself into water vapor or steam, and begins its incredible journey flying into the sky up towards the atmosphere. This is the first stage of the journey, and it's called evaporation, converting liquid to gas. The second step is when water converts itself into vapor. It rises towards the atmosphere, then cools down, transforming itself into clouds, which is the second stage of our journey, condensation, converting gas into liquid. Once the water has condensated and turned into clouds, it continues its journey by being blown by the wind. By moving from one place to another, the clouds that are moving. Clouds are tiny drops of water suspended in the air. So when clouds grow, they collect more and more water. And these water drops crash into each other and become big water drops. And at some point, they'll end up falling into the ground in the form of rain or even snow. This stage of the water cycle is called precipitation, which is technically the last stage. The water that falls into the ground, or precipitates, let's say, in the form of either rain or snow, may land in rivers or on the ground, to then seep through subterranean currents of water. All this water must continue its journey, covering large amounts of distances until it reaches the sea. When it arrives to the big blue sea, it will once again begin the process of the water cycle: evaporation, condensation, and precipitation.